Okay, so in this project, we're working with positive and negative shape relationships. And for this, we're using leaves and stems with a backdrop. The leaves are going to act as the actual positive, and then you have negative space. Negative space is everything, the airspace in between. This is an inking project where we're going to be inking the negative spaces, so this will be reversed out. Before we get started, I would have to transfer this drawing onto my Bristol, and I'm using a light table that I purchased on Amazon. So if you just go, you can adjust the light, and it's a nice way to transfer. You can also use a window by putting up your image, taping it onto the window, and then placing your board over it or your paper. That's one option. There's also the option of, if you have everything to scale and you want to transfer it onto here, using a graphite stick. You could use charcoal, but it's harder to erase, so just keep that in mind. So just using this on the entire thing and then turning it over, positioning it, taping it down so it's stable, and then tracing all of the outer contour edges. So I'm going to use the light table, and I'm going to get set up, and I'm going to go through and I'm going to trace only the outer contours. So if I see detail within a leaf, I'm not going to draw that. I'm only drawing the big outer shape. If I have really small detail, I may decide to keep it or lose it. But one thing to remember is if you have really thin leaves, you don't want to just draw a line for your drawing. You want to make sure there's a thickness, because that is a shape. It's a thin shape, and it's long, but it's still a shape, and it will be left white. Also, we'll be paying attention to all of these little details around the edges of things, because when this is inked in black and white, those edges are going to be really clear. You're going to see every little nuance. So if you have a lot of character in your leaves with edging or maybe some flowers or something, you really want to be careful on how you trace it, because you don't want to lose the integrity of the actual drawing. Some of my students, they're working on this project, they might have wires in the background, and I've suggested keeping some of that. I am not going to keep this one because I think it doesn't really go with the piece. One thing we've talked about and that we're working with is unity and balance. Your composition overall should feel balanced, and one way to check that is it's an equal weight between positive and negative shapes. So when you look at it, you should be able to turn it in any direction, and it should feel balanced between the two parts. We're also looking for small, medium, and large shapes, both in the subject matter and in the negative spaces. So those are two main things. I had this laid out horizontal because this is how I'm working, but I'm actually considering this as my composition. I could even flip it vertically and have this on this side if I wanted to do that and print it out that way, but for demonstration purposes, I'm just going to leave it as is. So I'm going to get started and get this transferred. Turning on my light. I want it on the brightest. The reason being is I have a bit of a gray background, so it's not going to be as easy to see. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tape this down. Just using you can use any tape for this, doesn't matter. Just to stabilize it so it doesn't shift while you're drawing. And I created a border that is the same dimension as my photograph. And you can see it's a little hard. If you have a darker room, it's hard to see right now. I can see it just enough. If you work in a little bit of a darker room, it's easier to see. Or if your backdrop is just white against black, I turned my photograph into black and white. It'll also be a lot easier to see, but I'm just going to do a section once I get this square. And then I'm also going to tape this down because I don't want anything to shift while I do the drawing. And I'll focus on this area here because there's a lot of small detail and larger detail in an open space to show the inking process and how to do this so you have really clean edges. Craftsmanship is key. You don't want your viewers to be distracted in your work by having to look past messy, you know, drawing and stuff. So I'm going to get started, remembering that as I look through here, I'm drawing light. I don't need to draw very dark. I'm using a mechanical pencil. I'm only drawing the outer contours. So when you have stems that meet up, I'm not going to draw that. I'm just drawing the actual shape I see. So if there's little negative spaces, they'll look like that. Stems, you know, they're tough to ink around, but just give them some kind of width. If they're really small, those details are really nice to capture. If you need to edit your drawing or your photograph because you have areas that are really clumped together, you can definitely do that. So if you're doing this kind of method or you're working with a window as your light table, your makeshift light table, draw what you see and then just try to freehand some of it, leaving out maybe some leaves. So I have shape, a negative shape in here, and I have little shapes in here. If you have an area that's clumped and you want to draw in a negative shape without losing, you know, the quality of your drawing, you can separate things more, leave things out. It does not have to be exact. That's relative in drawing. This is reference. This is not necessarily needed to or used to copy exactly, but to keep the integrity of it, give your finished work some representation of, you know, what you're using, but it doesn't have to be exact. Okay, so I'm only working in this area. Obviously, you know, if I were going to finish it, I work down here. So like I said, I'm only outlining the outer edges. So if something is overlapped, I'm not drawing where they overlap, just the new shape. So this is a little example of this stem is peeking out behind this leaf. I'm not going to draw the leaf with an edge and then that. If I do, make sure that you erase any of those overlapping marks and clean it up so that it is one new shape. So when you're done and you've checked everything and you've got your little details for negative shapes, which are fun because it adds a little more variety and it opens up some bigger shapes. I have little spots over here that I would get into. The next thing you're going to do is use one of your drawing pens, probably a thinner one. The thinner, that's a brush pen, don't want that. So a micron, this is a 02 and it's a really small tip. You could use this or not an 08 is bigger, maybe I'm going to work with the 03 micron. There's different types of pens. You got Faber-Castell, there's Copic. Copic is really nice, but a little more expensive. But these work well. You want a few different tips for drawing different ink lines, but for this purpose, we can just stick with one thickness because all of these negative shapes in between all the leaves and stems, that's what we're going to ink. And the reason that I am going to outline again with the ink is to create like a little barrier. When I lay down more ink, it helps it to not cross into this other shape. It's just a little trick, so it definitely helps. So I'm going to do that, and then we're going to start the overall inking process. So I'm just going over my pencil lines carefully. Just make sure before you ink that your drawing is exactly the way that you want it. So if you want to add it, I could add a leaf in here. I could take something out and erase it. I could reshape something. I could move something by angling this drawing a little bit different over the print once I've got most of it down. There's a lot of options. So just play with it until you get the results that you want. And also try to get, when you're finished and you've been sitting on top of it for a long time, put it across the room from you to look at it from an objective point of view, as if you were critiquing someone else's work, and see where there might be some issues. Does it feel balanced and unified? Is it interesting? Does it have a variety of shapes in both positive and negative shape? Does it have a nice flow to it? Meaning, can your eyes flow through the whole composition? Can you escape and come back on? We talked about that continuation to draw your viewer's eye throughout your composition. Okay, so I'm just going to finish this up and then we'll get started. Okay, so you have the outline with the pen, and one thing that you can do before going into some bigger areas is choosing one of your pens. Oh my Lord. All these little spots, tiny little negative spaces, as you go through, you can definitely just ink those in right away. One other thing, as you're inking, kind of move away from your hand. So if this is wet, you put your hand in it, you might pick some up on your hand and then blotch it somewhere else. So try and work, you know, whatever method you can to try and keep an area clean. So I would typically start here and then work my way over. Notice I have a piece of paper under my hand too. That can help prevent things getting messy. If you have anything on your hand, it's a protective barrier. So going in to some of these little areas and just make sure they're nice and clean. So you start out with the little tiny negative shapes. Oh, that's too big. Go back to my number 3. So I can fill all this little stuff in just with one of my pens, and any other areas that are really small. You can also use like your brush pens for these little areas if you have some that are small enough. So if I go back here, just make sure they're clean. I got a little sketchy there because I was moving kind of quick. Okay, so the next thing I would do is I would pick a brush pen. If you have different sizes, that is great. If you have a small enough size to get in here for some of these, you can just start filling in some of these small shapes. Just be careful. Don't drink coffee before you do this. if you tend to get shaky at all. All of these little, if you start with these, it kind of helps you feel it out a little bit. What's negative and what's positive. So this probably takes more time than anything, just getting this inked out and then filling in these little shapes, because you want the edges to be carefully done. A little more carefully than maybe I'm doing. I'm trying. I would say overall, so far I've been working on this for maybe an hour, and it's about halfway done in this part. So filling in this and doing all these little shapes, it'll take a little time. So I would say to be relaxed while you do it. You don't want to be stressed out doing this kind of work. It should be relaxing. Listen to some good music. Or music is better than watching TV because you don't want to be distracted and then you make a mistake. And it is ink, so if you make a mistake, you can't take it back. But if you make a mistake and say I slip, well, just make that negative space work for you and don't consider it a mistake. It's a happy accident, like Bob Ross would say. Okay, so going in, you could fill in all these little spots, and it takes quite a while. So the next thing I would do, once I get into my next bigger shapes, is I'm going to use my India ink, or, yep, it's India ink. I have Dr. Phil Martin's Black Star Matte Waterproof, and I haven't used this before, so this is the first time I'm trying it. One of my students bought it, I think it was last semester or the semester before, sometime in the last year, and it worked really well. Just be very careful when you're in your working area to work away from your work. I'm going to put it in a container so I'm not, it has a little dropper, so I can just drop some into here, into my container, put the lid on, and put it away from everything. Starting with some small brushes. I also have a water container to keep things clean if I need it, but you don't want to water down your ink. You may want a brush that has a really nice tip on it. You can also use your brush pens to work out from your edges a little bit. If you have a steady hand, which I don't have the steadiest of hands right now, you can just start going around your smaller areas. You can lay things flat, but remember, working away from you, I don't want to go like this because that's wet. So, and one more thing, if you want to move this around, make sure, I can turn this off, and I don't need my print anymore, so I can take this up. I would only need it if I was going to continue on this, but once you're done drawing it, you don't really need it. Carefully take off the tape. That way I can get rid of all of this. I'm just going to do it right now. Move it, get everything out of your way so that you can turn and work comfortably. Whatever way you need to do, so that you can stay away from wet areas. And my brush is really not the greatest brush here right now. Okay, I'm going to use a different one. I'll just show you like a variety of ways to use some brushes. So bigger areas, you can see you don't really need that big of a brush. One thing you can do when you're laying it down is go in some kind of cool pattern to kind of mimic the leaves. Make sure you're not dripping ink when you carry it over. So I could go like this and then work into the smaller areas. But usually you're going to want to work close in to your detail. This brush is just a cheap little round brush, has a good tip on it. Like I said, you can use your small brush pens to pull away from your edges before you use your actual paint brushes. That might help you, because like in an area like this, that's really tight and I don't want to mess with that right now. So just try and stay careful using the tip. I can use bigger brushes for these larger areas. And this is drying pretty flat, matte black without a whole lot of streakiness, so that's nice. If you get some streakiness, you can always go back over it. So I'm going to continue this and fast forward. Okay, so just doing this section to show you, how it's gonna kind of look. I don't know what that is. A couple things to remember is if you make a mistake, it's okay, because there's lots of little areas that it can get a little tricky. Look for wet areas. You stay away from them. When you're done going around everything, just kind of look for like little things like this where I kind of went in and I slipped. How can you fix that? I'm just going to reshape to make it work. And then here I like went way over, so I need to kind of look at that. Think, how do I want to fix it so it looks like it's intentional? Just make that stem really thin. You're gonna have maybe a few mistakes, and that is completely fine. So, but this is a great way to get used to working with ink, using the different tools, and seeing how you can create nice clean edges in your work, especially working with shape. And it's just a matter of like working away from those shapes and then filling in and then going back in and cleaning up some edges. And like I said, art is relative. Once this is said and done, nobody's going to see your photograph. They're not going to know what you were working from. They just want to see a beautiful piece of artwork. So as long as this looks good in the end, it's balanced, unified, clean, you've succeeded. So that's that. I'm not going to go in and finish the rest of this because that will take way too long. So anyways, I may do it on my own time and then shoot a picture of it later, but I can't wait to see all of your projects. Good luck.